to do better in the future, Father. In the mighty name of Jesus Christ, Father, you alone are Lord, Father, and you alone are God, Father. In the mighty name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Amen, amen. Thank you so much, Kabelo, for leading us in prayer. Thank you so much. May God bless you entirely. So, guys, welcome to today's Young and Dynamic session. And I'm so excited that we are to announce that our Executive Director, Ms. Elizabeth Tanya Masiwa, has been selected for the Southfield Trailblazers Awards. The Southfield Awards are in the recognition of women who are pioneers and of transformation, gender equality, diversity, and inclusion in their respective fields. So, guys, I'm kindly asking you to vote for Miss Tanya, and our technical team will be dropping on some links into the chat box. I can see people they have started to vote. So I'm kindly encouraging you, each and every individual, to vote for Miss Tanya. And the voting is still open up to 10 March. So Alec Manongwa has voted, Emmanuel Bradley has also voted. So you can vote 10 times in a day. Please, may you all go and vote for our Executive Director, Miss Tanya. We're also going to share the link in our respective WhatsApp groups, and so that we can vote as we are going to support our director. So thank you so much, Billy, for voting. Thank you so much, Kudakwashi Malekele, for voting. Melissa, thank you so much for voting. I can see Playing is also voting. You guys, you are so amazing. We want to bring it home. The trophy and the award is ours. So please check out for the link in the chat box, and also vote for Miss Tanya. So I'm so excited for today's session.
Mr. Michelle, if I can jump in right here, this is a very important moment right now.
Yes, yes.
Remember, we voted for Lord Gwendrimire, and he became Mr. Albinism Zimbabwe. We voted for Tawonga, and she managed to scoop that prize. So we need to win this. Will you allow us, Mr. Msharu, to just give 2 minutes for people to go into the chat box, click on that link, and go and vote now here? I can play some background music, if you don't mind, for about a minute while people are voting.
Yes, Pastor, please go ahead. I'm so excited.
Perfect. So I'll just play some music as I allow people to go and vote right now. Please click, someone share the link in the chat box so that we have that done now.
Kushikira rini wakanyarara, iwe uchikwanisa kushandura ai, chipo usarambe wakapfumbata, kushikira munyika chaonekwa ai. Just let your music be heard. If you believe you can make it to the billboard, I know nenguva diki, they'll see the best out of you. Kunyangwe ziwo menyika ikuseke, usarase tariro, hazingareme unosika chete iwe. Usatsikisirwe nezvinotaurwa nevanhu iwe, uri chiedza vamwe pavanovheneka iwe vheneka. Usatsikisirwe nezvinotaurwa nevanhu, uri ngirozi vamwe pavanobururuka iwe simuka uvhure mapapiro.
They say you're too old, but not too old for your purpose. And they say you're too young, but your voice can make this a better place. Just let your music be heard. If you believe you can make it to the billboard, I know Nenguva Diki will see the best out of you. Kunyango jiwo menyika ikuseke, usarase tariro, hazingareme unosika.
Yes, Mr. Bisharu, were the votes moving?
Yes, Pastor Mnashe, you know, I'm holding my device here and I'm looking straight to the votes. I can see votes are moving at a high speed. You know, I'm so excited. with the support that you are giving to our executive director. Thank you so much, Pastor, for amazing background music, and also for all dynamics who have voted. Someone is asked me in the chat box, am I allowed to share the link to my friends, to my relatives, to my siblings, to my guardian? Yes, you are allowed. Can you share the link as far as and wide as we can and vote for Miss Tanya? Thank you so much once again. Allow me, Pastor Mnashe, to move ahead with our today's program, as we are going to have an exciting session. So I'm giving 1 second to people to just mention 1 or 2 things that they have learned from last week's Young and Dynamic session. Can you drop in the chat box 1 or 2 things that you have learned from last week's Young and Dynamic session? For me, I learned that mental health is a basic human need, and your time is valuable enough. And also I've learned that be intentional about your success, and also embrace your talent. Don't but make the most of it. So yes, the last week's Young and Dynamic session was an interesting and exciting session. So today, as we are going to start a new series, Lift Up Africa series. So we are starting with today's topic titled African Mythology. So come and learn more about the African spiritual journey from pre-colonial era until now. So today's facilitator is the veterinary surgeon by profession, dedicated leadership practitioner and consultant with a passion of developing people into leaders, living out their life purposes, bringing transformation in their spheres of influence. He has close to 10 years experience as a resource person in leadership training and development in both Christianity and non-Christian forums. His research interests are in the areas of agribusiness, sustainable community development, and social entrepreneurship. So guys, allow me to welcome Dr. Chichetu as you will be taking us through the session. Over to you, Doctor. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tinashe. Can you please confirm that you can hear me? Somebody confirm, can you hear me?
Yes, Doc, we can hear you.
Yes.
Great, yes, thank you.
Doctor, we can hear you.
Thank you so much. So yeah, I think it's a privilege and an honor for me to just be a part of this whole initiative as we try to develop the next, maybe not even the next, but the current generation of leaders who we believe can spearhead the economic, social, and political transformation of Africa. So it's really an honor for me to be a part of this whole initiative, and also just to be a part of this series where we get to be talking about how we can indeed see Africa arising and taking up its rightful place within the whole global context. So without wasting much more time, let me quickly get into today's presentation. Oh, sorry, Tinashe. Can you please give me some rights so that I can share my screen? Is that possible?
Sure, Doc. Yes, Doc, on
you.
it. Yes, now you are able to share.
Great, thank you. Okay, let me try again. Still cannot share, Tinashe.
Okay, and now you've amended, please, Doc. You can also try again.
Let me try again. Oh, yes, thank you. All right. So this afternoon, which is really the first of my presentations, as Tinashe rightfully said, we are looking at African mythology. But within that whole broad understanding of African mythology, we are going to be focusing on how we can understand Christianity in the context of African religion, a historical perspective of African religion and Christianity. So this presentation is divided into two parts. The first part we're going to cover today, which is going to focus more on the African religious history, where we get to look at the African traditional religion and Christianity. Then the second part, hopefully, which we'll be able to cover next week, will then be looking at Christian development theology. How can Christianity spearhead development of Africa in the 21st century? Why? Because I do appreciate that this whole conversation is happening in the context of leadership development towards a more transformative approach to leadership in Africa. So I would want to close this whole conversation with us looking at how we can position Christianity to spearhead development of Africa in the 21st century. I strongly believe that the 21st century is ours for the taking as Africa. We can position ourselves as the powerhouse, global powerhouse, if we do the necessary reforms, and indeed if as the church we get to take our rightful place within the whole development agenda of Africa. So we'll get to cover that in more detail next week. So today I'm going to lay the foundation of the journey that we have traveled as Africa, of how to get that place where we get to talk about how did we get to where we are. And then next week we'll be looking at how then we can begin to build from where we are, so that we get to fulfill the aspirations of every young African right now. There's so much potential, so much hope within the African youths, but that can fail to be realized if I believe we do not address some of the issues that we are going to be discussing next week. So some good news. I think the overspread narrative of Africa is that of a dark continent. All right, mad with disease, wars, illiteracy. That's the general and the overplayed narrative when it comes to Africa. But we also have our own realities, especially in the 21st century. Some of the fastest growing economies are actually in Africa. And we actually have in many countries and many scientists within African countries actually taking the lead in as far as technological advancements is concerned. Kenya is doing very well, guys. Kenya is doing very well. We have Rwanda, which is also doing well. And we also have open markets. Africa is opening up with the African Continental Free Trade Area. There's so much good that is happening within Africa. There's improved literacy, there's improved health provision, improved education. So there's so much that we need to begin to also make noise about as Africans, so that we can begin to counter what I believe is an overplayed narrative of Africa. But this is not to say that there is still no gloom in Africa. You know, this African paradox is still very real. In spite of all the advancement and the progress that we have made, you find that there is still so much room for us to be better as Africa. And the African paradox is still very much real. You find that Africa is arguably the richest continent. We all know that. We have heard about this. And yet Africa is home to some of the poorest economies in the world. It's said to note that about 445 million people, were poor, which constitute about 34%. This was in 2020, just before COVID-19. And this is almost 9 times the average for the rest of the world. And then 30 more million people were plunged into poverty due to the COVID pandemic. And you also find that within Africa itself, most of the poverty is concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. Guys, I need you to take note of this. I need you to take note of this statistic, that most of the poverty is concentrated in the sub-Saharan Africa region. South Central Africa is the highest extreme poverty rate of 54.8%, followed by Southern Africa at 41.1%, and rates in Western and Eastern Africa are 36.8 and 33.8 respectively. What's of particular interest is the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, the Democratic Republic of Congo is arguably one of the wealthiest countries in the world. But statistics also portray the Democratic Republic of Congo as being home to 10% of the world's population in extreme poverty. And this does not make sense. How can you get to have the wealthiest country, one of the wealthiest countries in terms of resources, in terms of minerals, contributing 10% of the global poor? It does not make sense. Then North Africa, this is also very key. North Africa has managed to meet the SDG target of a poverty rate of below 3%. This was by 2019. And it's projected that by 2050, in North Africa, the poverty rate might have dropped to about 1.8%. So using the poverty line where a person is said to be living below $1.90 a day, you find that Africa's extreme poverty rate of 43.1% in 1981 was almost equal to the average for the rest of the world's, which was at 42.8%. So it would appear that since 1981, Africa seems to be getting poorer whilst the rest of the world progresses. Probably that's why we continue to bear these negative labels in spite of the significant gains that we have made as a continent and as a people. It's sad to note that we are still getting poorer whilst the rest of the world seems to be progressing. Another harsh reality of Africa is the issue of hunger. You find that another paradox there. We are home to a significant portion of the world's arable land, and yet we are unable to feed our own citizens. So of the 10 countries identified by the World Food Programme as having the highest number of people facing critical food insecurity in 2022, 5 of them were in Africa. 5 of them were in Africa, guys. And in sub-Saharan Africa, 45.5 million people in 12 countries, Central and Southern Africa, are likely to starve. There is gross food insecurity in sub-Saharan Africa, and 43.6 million people in 9 countries in East Africa also facing food insecurity. 30.4 million people in 16 countries in West Africa and the Sahel also facing food insecurity. So it's because of these statistics that is the young people, we also then get to be discouraged. We also get to be frustrated about our identity as Africa. So what has been the missing link? Definitely, it's not a question of resources. We do have the resources as a continent. And I believe it's also not a question of skilled personnel. I tell you, Africa is one of the biggest exporters of human personnel. So what I've grown to appreciate is the missing link in the development agenda of Africa is good leadership. It's good leadership. That's why programs like this one are very, very critical to us moving from that label where we are regarded as a dark continent to a place where we are at par with our global counterparts, where we are indeed taking up our rightful place, given the resources that we have, the mineral wealth that we have, the land that we have. We should be one of the powerhouses within the global space. Now, what is it that has really contributed to us missing this critical link, which is good leadership? I'd like to introduce to you the whole concept of what is called a worldview. So you find that a worldview is the set of assumptions and presumptions that a person holds consciously or unconsciously about how they perceive reality. So you find that it provides the basis for behavior, for thought and assumptions, which govern how we live. So worldview is the underlying set of ideas that enables people to cope with life in a given culture. So it is, I believe, the African leadership worldview that has been our biggest challenge to our development as a people. Now, you would appreciate that many efforts have been made in trying to address bad leadership in Africa. You appreciate that many books have been written, many workshops have been held, seminars have been held, so much money has been pumped into the whole initiative of trying to address bad leadership in Africa. Now, I believe the success or the output from all those efforts has been limited. Why? Because all those efforts have been primarily focusing on leadership practice. So the efforts have been trying to address leadership practice and undermining the place or the role of leadership theory. So this is where the whole concept of worldview comes in. Because once worldview of leadership informs how they're going to practice leadership. So in other words, once theory of leadership informs how they're going to practice leadership. So many efforts have failed to address the theory behind the leadership practice within the African context. And I'm only talking of Africa, not to say that this is just a challenge which is synonymous with Africa. You find that this is a global challenge in many contexts where the emphasis is placed on practice rather than on theory. But as you appreciate that a person's worldview is the one which informs how they will practice and live out every other concept in life. So you find that your worldview regarding success will inform how you will pursue success. Your worldview regarding marriage even will inform how you pursue marriage and even practice marriage. So it's the same thing when it comes to leadership. It's the same thing when it comes to development even. Your worldview regarding all those concepts will inform how you ultimately live out those concepts. So a person's worldview is reinforced through repetition of familiar actions and is generally taken for granted until one encounters a different worldview, which forces them to analyze why they do what they do or to perceive things in a different way. So until we get to a place where we begin to engage with the current worldview, it will be difficult for us to be able to address this leadership challenge that we are having in Africa in order to bring the much needed change, the much needed growth, and the much needed transformation that we need to see in Africa. Now, tied to the whole concept of worldship is the concept of religion. We need to appreciate that there's a very, very close, tightly knit relationship between one's worldview and one's religion. And in most cases, you'll find that religion dictates and shapes the worldview of a person. In other words, religion is at the core of a person's worldview. So this is why it's very important for us to look at this historical religious journey that Africa has taken. Because as we understand this religious journey that we have taken as Africa, we get to have a better appreciation of how we have developed the current leadership worldview that we have. So one's worldview is therefore essentially a manifestation of the underlying religious beliefs. And this close interplay between religion and worldview is very critical to leadership development, as it implies that we should not simply seek to have a change in leadership practice without addressing the underlying worldviews. Another important aspect for us to appreciate is the fact that worldviews are not stagnant. They constantly change. So you find that the traditional primal worldview of the 19th century is not what is now in the 21st century, even though there may be several continuities. And I always find this to be very interesting when people make reference to African traditional religion. Which era of Africa's historical journey are they really referring to? So that is a gray area that many people are not very conversant with, but we need to appreciate that. Our worldview, which means even our African traditional religion, has not been stagnant. It has been constantly changing as it has been interacting with different external forces. So you find that this dynamism of worldview demands that leaders must therefore be keen to keep abreast with changes in their own worldview and in the worldviews of the people that they seek to lead or that they lead. So as Africa, we need to appreciate that Africa is informed by two broad worldviews, all right? The traditional African worldview and what I would like to call the contemporary African worldview. You get to appreciate what I mean by the contemporary African worldview as we continue with our conversation. Now, the traditional African worldview, I'm looking at this pre-colonial. This is the 14th century going backwards, all right? This is pre-colonial, pre-slave trade. So this is what characterized the traditional African worldview. And remember the relationship between religion and one's worldview. So religion, you find that permeated both the private and the public spheres in ways that made it impossible to separate the two. So you could not talk of a public life and a private life. It was one. You find that religion influenced individuals to pursue a particular path in life, and this was also true for communities. And at the same time, it was also the glue that bound an entire community to follow a similar path as well. So religion was the basis upon which social trust was built in many African communities. So through religion, there were emotional linkages between the people, their identity-seeking behavior, and the key role of the shared partnership relationships that existed amongst the people. So religion, we find that it went beyond just a set of beliefs which may or may not instrumentally affect people's attitudes, but it contained its own norms and values, which define the boundaries of the different social spheres and determine the way they functioned. So you find that because of their religion, their lives were very much built around that. So in African traditional religion, pre-colonial, you find that life as they lived it was built around their religion. It was their spirituality from which life itself emanated. So you find that for the strong adherents, those who believed in God then, you find religions were systems of organizing society through the demarcation of that which was permissible and not permissible. So through religion, there was a well-established moral and ethical code. What was acceptable and not acceptable within each community. We need to appreciate that there's this general tendency to think to perceive African traditional religion as being one. We need to appreciate that it's different from Christianity and Islam. Christianity is the Bible. So you find that the basic and foundational dictates of Christianity are universal, which goes the same for Islam because it's founded upon the Quran. Now, with African traditional religion, there was no written scripture that informed how it was to be practiced. So as a result, you find that practice was passed on from generation to generation. So you discover there were differences, ethnical differences that would be identified and observed within the whole broad spectrum of African traditional religion. So within the African traditional religion, as I said, that the material, the physical, and the spiritual were so much closely intertwined. And you find that all of life emanated from the spiritual. So there was this clear hierarchy of spiritual beings within that traditional African religion. So supreme beings were the supreme being going by different names in different contexts. Here in Zimbabwe, in the Shona culture, it will be Musikavanu. In the Bele, it will be Nkulunkulu. So you find that different cultures, different ethnic groups had different names that they would assign to the supreme being. Then just below the supreme being will be the divinities or the deities. These were lesser gods. But you find that as scholars, they've indicated that in many cases, they were not really regarded as gods. So they were just seen as divinities and deities. Then was found also the ancestors, the dead relatives, they were also regarded as spiritual beings. So there was this very strong belief in life after death, in the whole concept of reincarnation. So ancestors also played a very significant role in as far as the spiritual hierarchy was concerned. Then we have the mediums and the diviners and the priests. Then we have also the kings. And you find that in some of the communities, the kings were also priests. Remember, religion and material life was intertwined, which meant that religion and the economic life of the people was intertwined. Religion and the political life of the people was also intertwined. Religion and the social aspect of the communities was also intertwined. Then below the kings will be having the subjects. So this was the spiritual hierarchy, pre-colonial. So as I've said, religion was intertwined with the daily lives of the people. So eating was a religious venture, dressing was religious, dancing was religious, procreation was religious, even war was religious. So you find that the empires were led by priestly kings. And if it was not a priestly king, then there would be diviners or the priest who would advise the kings. And it's interesting to note that pre-colonial Africa flourished and prospered. It is reported that pre-colonial Africa actually developed at par with its global Western counterparts. You need to take time to research on some of these notable pre-colonial African empires. So we have the Kingdom of Aksum, which was from 100 to 960 AD, and this covered the whole expanse from Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, South Sudan, and Yemen. Then we also have the Mali Empire. The Mali Empire is very popular because of one of its rulers, Mansa Musa. It is reported that Mansa Musa is reportedly, historians claim that he is actually one, is not the wealthiest, the richest man to have ever lived, Mansa Musa, who was at some point the ruler of the Mali Empire. It is reported that on one of his pilgrimages, as he was going through Egypt, Mansa Musa and his entourage will be just giving out gold bars to the citizens of Egypt. And for 7 years, Egypt's economy suffered because of Mansa Musa having passed through Egypt. Then we have the Songhai Empire, which was from 1000 to 1591 AD. And this covered Benin, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Bissau, Mali itself, Mauritania, Niger, Nigeria, Senegal, and the Gambia. Then we also have the Rosy Empire, which was from the 1220 to 1450 AD. And this covered Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. Then the Mutapa Empire, which also covered Lesotho, Mozambique, South Africa. These are just a few of some of the notable pre-colonial African empires. Now, these empires were renowned global powers. They traded as partners, even with the European counterparts. So these are some of the key characteristics of pre-colonial African religion. Number one, reality and destiny was deeply rooted in the spiritual. Like I've said, everyday life was intertwined with their religion. Then spirit beings, there were non-human spirit beings and spirits of dead relatives, the ancestors. And also, you find that pre-colonial African religion was characterized by polytheism, which is a belief in a plurality of gods, as seen by the many divinities below the supreme being, below the supreme God. And this proved to be quite instrumental when Christianity and Islam were then introduced into Africa. Then you find that the supreme being was regarded as impersonal. So you find that in pre-colonial African traditional religion, the people understood or perceived that they could not have a personal relationship with the supreme being. If anything, the supreme being could only be interacted with through that hierarchy of spirits, through the ancestors, through the divinities and the deities. So the supreme being was regarded as an impersonal supreme being. Then there was also this oneness with the environment. Like we say that all of life emanated from the spirituality of the African people. So there was this oneness with the environment. And you find that there was sacredness that was attributed to different inanimate objects, mountains, rocks, trees, and even living objects or living animals like the cattle when we talk of the bull of the family. So there was this understanding that non-human spirits could also abode in animate objects. So you find that there was this very strong relationship with one's environment. You could not destroy the environment as we are seeing people doing today, because the environment was seen as an extension of the people themselves, as all of them were seen as one global family united by the spiritual aspect of their religion. Then there was also a very strong sense of the sanctity of life. There was high regard for the value of human life. Then integrity and honesty were also values that were greatly upheld, and not to mention the Ubuntu philosophy. So you find that when we talk of the Ubuntu philosophy, we are really talking or making reference to pre-colonial African religion. As you see, as we continue with our conversation, this is different from colonial African religion and also post-colonial African religion. The Ubuntu philosophy is more deeply rooted in pre-colonial African religion. So what then changed? What then changed? Like we said, pre-colonial Africa, they were powerful regional empires. Wealth and affluence, as mineral wealth, benefited the entirety of the communities, and they traded as equal partners, and development in Africa was at par with its Western counterparts. So what went wrong? What changed in Africa's trajectory? You'll find that in the 15th century, the slave trade began. So with the advent of the slave trade, you find that there's a proliferation of wars that began to rise between the African empires. As empires sought to conquer other empires, then sell them off as slaves to the Europeans. So you find that this interaction with the Europeans also at this level brought or introduced the condemnation of the African religious worldview. So from the 15th century to the 18th century, slave trade is one of the biggest evils that are attributed to have caused the lagging behind of Africa. So for those whole 3-4 centuries, Africa, instead of focusing on development, Africa focused on selling its own people as slaves to the European. And as they were going to Europe, they were going there to develop Europe. And there also the condemnation of the African religious worldview began. Then now, with the 19th century came colonization. So this was now the occupation of African land by foreigners. And with colonization, you find that there was disruption of the African religious system. There was also disruption, consequently, of the African way of life, attitudes towards other humans, the environment, and even their spirituality. So from the 19th century, you find that a new worldview was now being introduced into Africa. And like we said, remember, worldview is not stagnant. So as any worldview comes into contact with an external worldview, there's an interchange that is bound to happen. So this is exactly what also began to happen to African religion. So with colonization, you find that the African religion system became corrupted. Colonization also came with Christianity, colonial Christianity. So you find that from the 15th century, Christianity in the form of Roman Catholicism was to spread right across Africa, particularly also in sub-Saharan Africa. So as the explorers came through to Africa, they also came with them the missionaries. Unfortunately, there was a selective teaching of the scriptures by the missionaries. So the Christianity that the Black indigenous Africans were being exposed to was a censored Christianity. All right, we'll get to talk more about that just now. But however, in 1500 to 1650, you find that this is the time where the Reformation happened, in the Roman Catholic Church, and this gave rise to the Protestant brand of Christianity in Europe. So you find that as we go to the 19th century, there was more intensive influx of European missionaries into Africa. And now it was both the Catholics and the Protestants. And it reached its climax in 1885, with many Africans being converted to Christianity. But we also need to appreciate that around the 19th century, there was also the proliferation of what is known as the comparative theology, which advocated for examining indigenous religious systems only to prove that Christianity is the only true religion among the multitudes of what turned out to be, in the last analysis, pseudo-religions, Satan's empire. So African religion was then perceived as a pseudo-religion. It was then perceived as an agent of Satan's empire. So this is the theology that informed many of the missionaries that came to minister in Africa from the 19th century. So you find that early Christian evangelizers were therefore convinced that Christianity could not be based on traditional culture, and that there was no real continuity between African traditional religions and the Christian message. So you'd find, and as you'd expect, this led to a colonial thinking, or in other words, this led to a colonial theology, with features such as domination, silencing of others' voices, and scenarios of subalternity. So you find that the Black majority within the colonized communities had to convert to Christianity, this colony Christianity, because their own traditional African religion was being denounced as that of Satan. So from 1885 up to 1945, you would also need to appreciate that during this season, there was also a rise of the Pan-Africanism movement in the US. So from 1945, you find that this movement had also shifted to Africa. And it was as a result of this movement that the struggle for independence within the African context was born. So you find that consistently, Pan-Africanism was to a large extent a vision that was promoted by the Black elite. And this was to try to push and to initiate the whole fight for independence amongst Africa itself. So from 1945, we begin to see Africa's struggle for independence. And around the 1960s, we also begin to see the emergence of an African liberation theology. Okay, so this was now within the context of the church. Remember, for close to 100 years, Africa was under colonization. And over that 100 years, a significant proportion of the indigenous African people had been converted to Christianity. But with the advent of Pan-Africanism, there was a reawakening within the African people. And there was this need and this desire for them to yet again reconnect with their traditional African theology, their traditional African religion. So you find that in the 1960s, there was this emergence of the African liberation theology. So the earliest form emerging alongside missionary and colonial incursions into Africa has been termed enculturation liberation theology. So in the enculturation liberation theology began at around the same time that the Christianization of Africa began, end of the 19th century, early 20th century. There was already this theology that was rising within the African community itself, which sought to eliminate the denigration of African religion and culture. So as the missionaries denigrated African religion and culture, this gave rise to this enculturation liberation theology, which also sought to uphold African religion as an equal religion par to Christianity or any other Western religion. So the second form common to Southern Africa, including Tanzania and South Africa in particular, is Black theology, or simply liberation theology. And this rose to prominence following the rise of liberation theology in South America. So you find that the emphasis here was on the political and the economic dimensions of the struggle against various forms of colonization. So as Black theology took root, you find that even the fight for independence also intensified. So you find that a distinctive feature of this form is a deep sense of the ambiguity of both the Bible and Christianity, seen in each the capacity for domination and liberation. So there was this realization that the Bible can be used for domination, and equally the Bible can be used for liberation. Then the third form of liberal or liberation theology was the African feminist theology, which was emerging out of both the African theology and the Black theology. So it shares elements of their social analysis, but its emphasis is on gender equality. Then the fourth form is relatively new, and I believe we are living in part this fourth form, the post-colonial theology. And you find that we'll get to talk more about it just now, that the post-colonial theology is what is then also informed even our modern day theology. It has its limitations and shortcomings, which I hope we'll be able to also look at. So you find with this proliferation of the African liberation theology, there was the rise of the African indigenous churches. So as the Africans sought to reconnect with their religious heritage, but remember they'd been Christianized for close to a century now. So this gave rise to African indigenous churches. So these were a result of the reflection by Africans on African religions and cultural heritage and Christian teachings. So it was how then can we reconnect with our Africanness within the context of Christianity. So this gave rise to the African indigenous churches. Then you would need to appreciate that the system of slavery, colonization, and apartheid through their laws and attempts at social engineering led to the dehumanization of the African self. So as a result of this dehumanization process, you find that the African indigenous churches then provided an outlay through which the African person can yet again regain their dignity as human beings. So the African was deliberately placed at the periphery of the economic center during the whole period of colonization, which led to serious deprivation. So Africans were forced to live in reserves, in homelands, townships, and other areas designated for them. So the environment in these areas were not conducive for healthy living. It is within this context of deprivation and hopelessness that the AICs emerged. They provided for their members resources to engage with and survive these conditions. So the church needed to address issues of social justice, inequality, poverty, and racism. So with the advent of the African indigenous churches, the call and the fight for independence was even further intensified. So you find that the spirit is the lifeblood of the African indigenous churches, and indeed of the then newer Pentecostal churches moving into the 1990s and then into the 2000s. So it is the source of revelation, prophecy, illness, detection, nature, and the impact of evil, knowledge concerning healing, and knowledge concerning myth and ritual. For us to have a better appreciation of the role that the Spirit played in the life of the African indigenous churches, we need to understand that during the colonial era, you find that the colonial Christianity did not emphasize the spirituality of Christianity itself. Colonial Christianity did not address the issues of revelation. It did not address the issues of prophecy. It did not address the issues of illness dictation. It did not address the issues of evil, the nature and impact of evil. And you find that indeed colonial Christianity did not address the issue of moral and ethical conduct of the believer. Why? Because it would then have warranted for them to begin to engage with colonization itself as a concept and as a practice. So the AICs gave this platform where people could connect with their existence, much like the way it was pre-colonial. And remember, like I said, pre-colonial, the life of the African emanated from their spirituality. So you find that with the African indigenous churches, they began to tap into that aspect of the African heritage, where the spiritual also then began to take center stage in as far as the life of the African was concerned. And it was easy for that to happen because of that heritage, spiritual heritage that we had as Africa going back to pre-colonial colonization. So this is the summary of it. From 1945 to date, you find that Africa began to attain its independence. And as Africa attained its independence, and with the emergence of the African indigenous churches, you find that there was an awakening of a hope for a better Africa. And you find that within the 1970s, 1960s, as many African countries began to attain their independence, and through the interaction of the liberation fighters with the Soviet Union, with Cuba, with China, you find that independent Africa predominantly adopted African socialism as the model of governance within the African context. But we need to appreciate that this African socialism was coming in the context where we were now having the indigenous African churches, which were trying to reconnect with their African heritage spiritually, but at the same time also upholding the Christian teachings. And we also need to appreciate that as Africa gained its independence, it was coming from a period close to 100 years of colonization, where Africa, during that time, it had been disconnected. The life of the African, as he had known it pre-colonization, had been transformed and changed. And as I said, and I continue to emphasize, that pre-colonization, the African's life was connected. It was intertwined, the spiritual and the physical and the material. So the economic, the political, and the social aspects of the Africans' life were very much informed and connected to their faith, to their religion and their spirituality. But within those 100 years, you find that the economic and the political aspect of the whole existence of the African was disconnected from their spirituality, because they then did not have the privilege or the place to be dictating their own destinies in as far as their economies, in as far as their politics was concerned. So independent Africa was coming from this reality, where for close to 100 years it had been disconnected. The political and economic life of Africa had been disconnected from its spiritual life. So what the colonial masters had done is they allowed for the continuation of the social aspect or the social connection between everyday life and the spirituality of the African. So that's why you find that on the most part, when we now talk of African traditional religion, we are mostly making reference to the social aspect of the African traditional religion. We are looking at family rights. We are looking about the rights of the dead. The whole concept within the Shona culture, it's called Kuroba Makuwa, where you go through ceremonies to bring back the spirits of the dead. We are looking at the whole concept of respect and honor, the whole concept of marriage, of lobola. So the social side of the African, its connectedness with their spirituality, you find that the colonial masters did not touch much, but the economic and the political was disconnected from their spirituality. So independent Africa was coming with this background. So African socialism, you find that it found a place within the African context, which is now disconnected. So the politics of Africa and the economics of Africa, as it became independent, post-colonial, post-colonialism was now divorced from its spirituality. It was now divorced from its spirituality. So even with the advent of the African indigenous churches, you find that their spirituality did not extend to the economy of the African states. It did not extend to the politics of the African states as well. So you find that as Africa began to practice socialism, African socialism, and as a result of that disconnection that happened over the 100 years of colonization, you find that the moral and ethical code that kept the African community together was also disrupted. There was a disintegration of the moral and ethical code of the African society as a whole, as the political and the economic aspects of daily life was disconnected from their spirituality. And you find that, as I've already indicated, that colonial Christianity also was silent, deliberately silent about the moral and ethical side of Christianity. So this is also very key as we are looking at post-independent Africa, as we are looking at post-colonial Africa, as we are looking at the African indigenous churches. So the African indigenous churches were so much characterized with power, spiritual power. And you find that from a political perspective now, as Africa took to ruling and governing itself, but now with that reality of a deficient moral and ethical code, you find that African socialism was marred by gross corruption. So 1960s and 1970s, you find that Africans did not realize the hope that they had for Africa. The hope for a better Africa post-independence was not realized because of that deficiency that had been created over the 100 years of colonization. So we move from the 1970s, corruption is rampant, and now the Western world is beginning also to come down on Africa. There's a call now for Africa to begin to democratize, to go for democracy. So there was democratization of Africa now as we went into the 1990s. And we need to appreciate that the 1980s was regarded, is generally regarded as a lost decade for Africa. Why? Because as the cause for change in post-independent Africa became louder in the 1970s, and the Western powers that had been supporting, that had been doing business now with the new African governance, began to call for reforms within the governance systems. You find that 1980 was characterized by a lot of reforms within the governance systems in Africa, but these reforms were only superficial. So the reforms was if Africa was now going for the privatization route, but you find that it only further promoted corruption because it was only the elites of the ruling government would also then tend to benefit from that privatization process. But in the eyes of the West, Africa was reforming, so aid continued to come. Aid continued to come, but in reality, there was no real reform or reformation that was happening. So Africa, you find that during that whole decade, not much development was observed. And as you'd expect, there now began a deterioration of the infrastructure that even Africa had inherited from its colonial masters in the 1980s, which also gave to louder cries by the African civilians now. And this led to the 1990s call for the democratization of Africa, if Africa was to continue to receive aid from its Western counterparts. So the 1990s also then gave rise to the African Renaissance. Take note, we are having the African indigenous churches, and we are also now having the African Renaissance. And former South African President Thabo Mbeki is one of the champions of the African Renaissance in the 1990s, where now, upon realization that indeed Africa was on the wrong trajectory, if Africa continued on the trajectory that it was on, it was never going to fulfill the aspirations of its people, then Africa was not going to develop at the same rate as its global counterparts. So there was this call of the need for Africa to reconnect yet again with its original African religious roots. So this gave rise to the African Renaissance. So you find that as was in contemporary China, where there was the Confucian revival. In Africa, we then had the famous African Renaissance. Remember, this was not like the very first time where Africa had sought to reconnect with its Africanness, with its original African religion. Pan-Africanism had also been founded on this concept of African Renaissance. So you find that African Renaissance was geared at going back to an African philosophy that was rooted in the whole Ubuntu philosophy, I am because we are. So as the national leaders realized that corruption was rampant, and with the call for democratization, there was then this response where they are saying, let's yet again go back to adopting the Ubuntu philosophy, where the emphasis is on the community rather than individuals. So you find that the African Renaissance was regarded as a political, economic, and cultural vision that envisaged and aimed to achieve the development of the continent's material, human resources, as well as the upliftment of the continent's inhabitants. So the vision emphasized that the inhabitants of Africa had to take responsibility for their own renaissance. So it was Africans needed to take responsibility for their own progress. Africans needed to take responsibility for their own development. So what it sought to do, remember, like what I've said, that over the 100 years of colonization, Africans had been disconnected. The economic and political aspect of Africans had been disconnected from their spirituality. So the African Renaissance was in a way trying to reconnect the economic and the political aspects of Africa yet again to its spirituality. So you find that the economic and the political dimensions of the African Renaissance encompass sustainable development, the promotion of democracy and good governance, the need for peace, as well as the termination of neo-colonialism and the negative consequences of the latter. So this was an attempt to reconnect the economic and the political aspects of the African reality to their spirituality. But was it enough? Is the African Renaissance enough to propagate Africa into its next level of development? And as I've always already said, as I began this conversation, as we looked at how Africa continues to be a paradox, how Africa has continued to be marred by poverty, yet it is one of the wealthiest continents, how Africa has continued to be plagued by hunger, yet it is the greatest proportion of the world's arable lands. You then begin to question even the effectiveness of the African Renaissance. And friends, let me at this point submit this to us. What I believe has been one of the key limitations of the African Renaissance, and what I believe has hindered the African Renaissance from achieving its full potential, and what I also believe has hindered the African indigenous churches slash the Pentecostal movement from also achieving its fullest potential in as far as bringing transformation within Africa, within the African context, is that deficiency which I mentioned earlier. That deficiency which came as a result of the disintegration of the moral and the ethical code that Africans lived by pre-colonial. So as the African church has grown over the last 20 to 30 years, post-colonialism, post-independence, if you like us to call that, as the African church has grown, the African church has emphasized the economic empowerment of the African person. It has emphasized the social empowerment of the African person, but it has not been as deliberate about emphasizing and establishing and developing a moral and ethical code, which is to go and to restrict or to govern that prosperity. And this is the same for the African Renaissance. So even as some leaders in some sections of Africa have sought to go back to the Ubuntu philosophy, have sought to go back to pre-colonial African religion, it is within a context where we are having a disintegrated moral and ethical code of conduct. So you find that even the African Renaissance began around 1996. But now, 2023, you find that it seems corruption is actually on an increase. Africa is still gravely hindered by corruption. And I believe that the missing link has been ethical and moral code, which disintegrated as a result of colonial Christianity, which disintegrated as a result of that disconnection of the African from their spirituality. That is the aspect of the economic, the political, and the social as well. So the African person, as they survived and lived through the 100 years of colonialism, did not then deliberately nurture and force a moral and ethical code for their societies. So even with the advent of independence, even with the emergence of the African indigenous churches, which then sought to correct the censored Christianity or the censored gospel that was being ministered or shared to the African people during colonization, even then you find that the indigenous African churches have not been as deliberate as they should be when it comes to addressing the moral and the ethical code for the African society. And with the African Renaissance as well, falling short in that regard. And I believe, friends, this is why we still are where we are as an African people. This is what has stalled our progress. This is what has hindered us from fully optimizing on our capacities as an African people. This is why we continue to have bad leadership within the African context, in spite of how Africa is yet again reconnected with this spirituality, in spite of how Africa is yet again reconnected its daily life with its spiritual life, it has not done so in the context of a well-defined moral and ethical code. So friends, let me stop here for today. So next week, we'll be now picking up from there and discussing how then can we build from this current reality? How then can we foster a theology, a Christian theology, which is pro-development, which is pro-progress, which also is anti-corruption? How then can we begin to have our Christianity as the young people in today's context beginning to both impact in our daily lives, in our economies, and indeed in our politics? So that's what we'll be covering next week. But I believe from today's session, we have a good appreciation of how we are where we are and how it will be difficult, if not impossible, for us to think of going back to a pre-colonial African religion. Why? Because the worldview, that worldview has evolved over time. As that worldview interacted with the different worldviews over the centuries, we cannot hope to have yet again a purely African religious worldview. We need to develop a more development-oriented African worldview, which I'm now calling the contemporary African worldview, which is built around the Christian faith, as we have seen that Christianity has now become the predominant informant of today's worldview. So we will talk more about that next week. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chichetu, for an awesome and powerful, interesting session. So as I'll be sharing a few nuggets that I've managed to note. I've noted that religion goes beyond belief, and also pre-colonial African empires were at par with the Western countries. I have also noted that spiritual aspect gave people the ability to be oneness. And I also noted that colonization corrupted African culture. So there is a lot of appreciation. Thank you from the participants that have joined today. And the session was very, very deep and interesting. I said to myself, I feel like I'm going to write an exam after this session. It's something that I need to take seriously. Thank you so much, Doc. I'm looking forward for next week. I've put a reminder on my calendar, and I'll invite 2 or 3, 4 people to come and have this interesting discussion. Allow me to end this Young and Dynamic session by reminding people to vote for Miss Tanya for the competition, for the award that we have circulated the link. And also remember to comment, like, share Young and Dynamic post on Facebook and also in the society channel. Remember also to like, share, and comment ABC's Prosperous Minds Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram page. And we are still in the 90 days of Lift Up Africa prayer campaign. So you are also reminded to connect at 6:30 in the morning and also at 8:30 in the evening. Global Intercessor platform is open 24 hours. So remember to connect anytime, to pray for yourself and also to pray for the nation. This is from us. My name is Tina Shemshado. See you next week, same time, same venue. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Tinashe.